A contractor wanted nearly $30,000 to clear Eli Mercer's worst hillside. Eli answered with 25 rough goats and a roll of electric netting. The first doe ignored the grass and bit into thorny rows. Eli had no idea whether he had found a solution or bought a new problem. The hill rose behind his barn in southern Missouri, part of a 64-acre place that had once carried cattle and then spent years carrying almost nothing but brush. From the county road, the property looked green. Up close, green meant several different things. It meant old fescue trapped under dead stems. It meant greenbrier hooked into jacket sleeves. It meant cedar seedlings, sumac, buckbrush, multiflora rose, blackberry, and vines woven so tightly through old fence that Eli sometimes found the wire only after it caught his jeans. The useful ground was scattered. A field near the house could still be cut for hay. A narrow bench beside the creek stayed open enough to walk. The rest came in pieces, separated by slope, brush, rock, and neglect. Eli was 45 when he bought the place. He had spent most of his adult life repairing municipal trucks and welding equipment for a road department. He could rebuild a hydraulic cylinder, straighten a bent bracket, and make a temporary repair hold longer than it had any right to. That background created his first mistake. He looked at the farm and saw a mechanical problem. Cut the brush, pull the old wire, smooth the rough spots, seed the ground. Repeat until the place looked like pasture again. The first month, that logic felt reasonable. He rented a heavy brush mower and started behind the barn where the slope was gentle. The machine chewed through blackberry and soft saplings. The view opened almost immediately. For 2 evenings, Eli stood at the barn door and admired a strip of ground he had not been able to see across when he bought the farm. Then he moved farther uphill. A length of old woven wire, buried under years of dead vegetation, wrapped into the mower. Eli shut everything down before it did serious damage, but freeing the wire took most of an afternoon. 2 days later, the tractor slid sideways on a damp slope just far enough to make his stomach drop. He stopped the machine, backed out slowly, and returned it before the rental week was over. That was when he called a clearing contractor. The contractor walked the property, looked at the steep sections, the hidden fence, the scattered mature trees Eli wanted to keep, and the poor access on the back side. His estimate was not outrageous for the work. It was simply more money than Eli could spend. Nearly $30,000 for the first major block. Before lime, seed, new fence, water lines, or livestock, Eli folded the estimate and stuck it in the glove box of his truck. For a few weeks he went back to hand tools, chainsaw, loppers, a small walk-behind cutter. He opened lanes instead of fields. That helped him move through the property, but it did not solve the larger problem. The plants he cut kept living. Rose sent new shoots. Blackberry came back. Greenbrier ran along the ground and climbed whatever remained. Where he exposed soil too suddenly, weeds filled the light before grass had much chance to respond. By midsummer, Eli understood something he had missed when he bought the place. Removing brush and building grazing ground were not the same job. One could happen in a weekend. The other needed a system. He did not have one. The idea of goats reached him from an unexpected place. One morning, driving to pick up a hydraulic hose for work, Eli passed a utility right-of-way where temporary fencing ran beneath a transmission line. Inside it, a group of goats was standing on their hind legs and stripping leaves from woody growth that a mower would have had trouble reaching around the poles. He slowed down. 2 days later, he passed again. The goats had moved. The first section was not bare, but it was visibly opened. Eli found the number of the vegetation contractor and called. He expected a sales pitch. Instead, the man gave him warnings. Goats would eat brush, but they would also eat plants Eli liked. A big field would let them choose only their favorites. Weak fence would turn the whole project into goat recovery. Water placement could concentrate animals in the wrong place. The work came from timing, pressure, and rest, not from releasing goats into a thicket and hoping for a miracle. That last part caught Eli's attention. The animals were not the clearing crew by themselves. They were one tool inside a moving system. That was language he understood. He spent the winter reading, visiting a couple of local goat owners, and pricing what he would actually need. Not just animals. Fence charger, netting, polywire, posts, trews, hose, mineral feeder, a small handling area. Hay for the periods when the land could not carry the herd. He chose hardy mixed meat goats rather than building the project around show ring appearance. He wanted sound feet, useful mothers, and animals that could work uneven ground without needing him beside them every hour. By March, he had 24 does and 1 buck. They were not impressive from a distance. One doe had a white blaze over one eye. Another had a scar along her shoulder. Several were smaller than Eli had imagined when he first pictured a herd reclaiming land. But size was not the question. The question was whether their normal behavior could be pointed at the work he could not afford to do with machines. He chose an 11-acre block above the barn for the first test. He did not open all 11 acres at once. He cleared only enough lane to carry fence, inspect corners, and reach water. A portable tank sat on the access road. Hose ran downhill to a small trough. Temporary electric netting made the first cell. Eli tied bright orange survey ribbon at the corners because the brush was so thick he could lose sight of the fence line from 20 yards away. Then he opened the gate. The goats did not rush uphill like a trained crew. They milled around the opening. One stopped to scratch against a post. 2 called toward the trailer. Another tested the netting with her nose and jumped backward. Then the white-blazed doe stepped past a patch of grass, stretched her neck into multiflora rows, and began pulling leaves from between the thorns. Within minutes, others joined her. They worked the edges first. Leaves disappeared. Vine tips vanished. Blackberry lost its soft growth. Some goats reached high. Others pushed beneath branches and opened small pockets of light. Eli stood outside the fence holding the folded contractor estimate he had brought from the truck for no good reason. The hillside still looked terrible. That mattered. There was no instant transformation, no clean before and after line. No moment where brush became pasture because goats had arrived. At the end of the first day, the stems were still standing. At the end of the first week, most of the hillside was still brush. What changed first was not the land. It was the pattern of damage to the plants. Leaves were gone from the species the goats preferred. Tender regrowth appeared. When Eli returned the herd later, some of that regrowth disappeared again. He began writing down what happened in each cell. Date in, date out, rain, fence voltage, water use, which plants were hit first, which were mostly ignored. How long the ground rested before he came back. At first, the notes felt excessive. By June, they were the only reason he noticed his next mistake. Moving fence after a full workday was tiring. Eli started making the cells larger. The goats seemed happy with the extra room. They had more choices and spent fewer hours complaining at the gate. Eli told himself larger cells were more efficient. The notes told a different story. In the big cells, the herd kept returning to the most palatable patches. They stripped favorite leaves, walked past tougher stems, and spent too much time around shade and water. Some plants were being hit repeatedly, while other parts of the cell were barely touched. The goats were busy. The land was not changing evenly. Then a storm exposed the weakness in the whole arrangement. Heavy rain pushed tall weeds across one side of the electric netting. Wet vegetation bled power from the fence. By the time Eli came home, the charger was still pulsing. But the line was weak enough that several goats had pushed through and were standing in the open lane outside the cell. None reached the road. None were hurt. But Eli spent an hour in rain and mud rebuilding the line. Then another hour walking the perimeter with a flashlight because he no longer trusted what he could not see. That night, he stopped thinking of the fence as a container. It was part of the grazing decision. The next morning, Eli changed the system. He went back to smaller cells. He trimmed only the vegetation that threatened fence function. He moved water to keep the herd from camping in one corner. Most importantly, he stopped asking whether a cell looked finished. He began asking whether the goats had done enough damage to the target plants to justify leaving. Sometimes that meant a move after a day, sometimes two, sometimes longer when the growth was heavy and conditions allowed it. The calendar did not control the rotation. Plant response did. By late summer, Eli had an accidental experiment on his hillside. One narrow strip had been browsed in small cells, then rested before the goats returned. Beside it was a strip he had cut with machinery early in the season and mostly ignored afterward. Both looked open in May. By August, they looked different. The mowed strip had produced a thick flush of new woody growth from the same crowns Eli had cut. The browsed strip still had stems, but many of them carried less leaf area, and more sunlight was reaching the ground between them. Eli did not treat that as proof that goats could replace every machine. They could not. He still cut trees that were too large. He still removed dangerous wire by hand. He still used a saw to open lanes and a tractor where the tractor made sense. But he no longer needed every acre to become machine-ready before it became useful. That changed the economics of the farm. It also changed what Eli considered progress. In the beginning, he wanted bare sight lines, clean ground, brush gone. Now he was satisfied when he could walk a fence, when light reached the soil, when desirable forage had room to respond, and when the goats could return to a rested cell without immediately running out of useful browse. During the second year, he began working below the opened canopy. He took soil samples instead of guessing. He applied amendments only where the tests and intended use justified them. He seeded small areas first, knowing that a beautiful seed mix on paper meant nothing if moisture, competition, or timing were wrong. Some attempts failed. One patch germinated and then burned up in a hot stretch. Another came in well but was shaded again because Eli had not weakened the brush above it enough before seeding. He stopped treating failure as evidence that the whole idea was wrong. He treated it as location-specific information. By the end of the second summer, the original 11-acre block no longer looked like one continuous wall. It had lanes, openings, browse zones, shaded pockets, and ground cover where almost none had been visible before. The brush was not gone. It had become something Eli could move animals through, instead of something that stopped him at the edge. Then the third spring came in wet. The creek stayed up. Low ground that usually firmed by April remained soft well into May. The upper slopes were growing, but slowly. The easiest grass was on the lower benches, and the lower benches were also the easiest places to move fence after work. Eli began using them more often. At first, nothing looked wrong. The goats were eating, the fields were green. The herd moved without the obvious hunger he had worried about during his first year. That green fooled him. Because the lower ground recovered quickly on the surface, Eli shortened the return interval. The brush there had already been weakened, so the goats spent more time grazing close to the ground than they had during the early reclamation phase. They were also returning to the same wet areas more often than his old notes would have recommended. Eli noticed the pattern only after one doe stopped coming to the trough with the others. She was standing under a cedar, head level, not collapsed, not dramatic, just separated from the herd in a way that did not fit her normal behavior. He caught her and checked her more closely. She had lost condition faster than he realized. A second doe looked similar, then a third. Eli called his veterinarian. The problem was not one mysterious disease, and it was not proof that the goats were weak. It was a management pileup, wet conditions, repeated use of lower ground, nutrition shifting as the herd moved from higher browse to shorter forage. Parasite pressure rising at the same time. Eli had convinced himself the farm was finally becoming easier. That last part bothered him most. For 2 years, the goats had done well enough that Eli had started using the word hardy as though it meant protected. It did not. A goat could be well suited to rough ground and still lose condition under the wrong pressure. A browse-based system could still create parasite problems when animals were repeatedly brought back to contaminated low forage. A productive doe could still need treatment. A green field could still be the wrong place at the wrong time. Eli worked with the veterinarian, treated the animals that needed treatment, and began monitoring the herd more deliberately. He watched body condition. He checked eyelid color as one practical warning sign, rather than waiting for an animal to look obviously sick. He used fecal testing when the situation called for it. He also did something harder. He took the goats off the easy ground. That meant feeding hay while other parts of the farm were technically green. It felt backwards. It cost money. It also bought time. The lower benches rested. The herd regained condition. Eli reopened higher browse in smaller cells and stopped treating the rotation like a route that had to continue in one direction. He built what he called an escape hatch into the system. One dry lot near the barn could hold the herd briefly when grazing decisions got tight. A sacrifice area gave him somewhere to feed, without pretending a paddock was ready when it was not. He kept a little more hay than his optimistic budget said he should need. He reduced the number of animals he carried into winter. The goal was no longer to prove how little input the goats required. The goal was to avoid being forced into a bad decision because he had nowhere else to go. That changed the farm more than any seed mix. By then, Eli had learned that most of his expensive mistakes began several days before they became visible. A weak fence started with weeds touching wire. A thin paddock started with returning too soon. A sick-looking goat often started with smaller changes he had failed to notice. A failed seeding started before the seed bag opened, when he chose a place that still had too much shade or too little moisture. The work became less dramatic as he improved at it. He checked fence voltage before a move. He watched where the herd went first when a gate opened. He noted which does maintained condition and which ones needed more help. He stopped keeping an animal simply because he had paid for her once. When replacement duelings were born on the farm, he kept the ones that fit his ground and his management. Sound feet mattered. Mothers that raised kids without constant intervention mattered. Animals that stayed productive in his rotation mattered. The herd slowly became more specific to the place. So did the way Eli used equipment. That was one of the changes he had not expected. In the first year, machinery and goats had felt like competing answers. Either he paid for steel and diesel, or he tried to make animals do the work. By the third year, that argument no longer made sense. The goats opened access. Once a lane stayed open and the hidden wire was removed, Eli could bring a small tractor into places that had been too risky before. He could haul posts instead of carrying them. He could spread lime on a test area without forcing a machine through shoulder-high brush. He could cut a mature sapling the goats would never control, drag it out, then let the herd work the regrowth around it. The machine became more useful because it was no longer being asked to solve every problem at once. The goats became more useful for the same reason. There were also places Eli deliberately left alone. A steep draw held soil better with roots and cover than it would have as a clean slope. A strip of brush along the creek gave him no reason to fight it, simply because brush had once been the enemy. He fenced around areas that needed protection and focused pressure where he actually wanted a change. That restraint saved labor, but more importantly, it stopped him from confusing neatness with function. On the parts he did manage, the sequence became clearer. First, create access. Then use concentrated browsing to weaken selected growth. Give the plants time to respond. Return only when the ground and forage were ready. Use tools, seed, or soil amendments where they had a defined job. Watch the animals. Keep another option available. No single step was dramatic enough to explain the transformation by itself. Together, the steps started compounding. So did Eli. During his first year, he could name the plants he hated. By the fourth year, he could name the decisions that made those plants stronger or weaker. That was a different kind of knowledge. He knew which south-facing cells dried first. He knew which shaded draw held moisture after the ridge had browned. He knew that one rocky strip looked useless in early spring and then produced a surprising amount of browse later. He knew which fence corner always needed an extra post after heavy rain. None of that sounded impressive when spoken out loud. Together, it was the operating system of the farm. The visible change was easier to explain. From the barn, Eli could now see sections of the upper slope that had been hidden when he bought the property. A stone line from an old field boundary had reappeared. Mature oaks stood with open space around their trunks. Blackberry still grew along several edges, but it no longer formed a continuous wall. Some brush remained intentionally because the goats could use it, and because bare ground was not the goal. The original 11-acre block had become a set of working paddocks rather than a reclamation project with no end point. There were permanent corner posts in places where Eli once used orange ribbon just to find his way back out. A simple water line served several cells. The temporary netting was still temporary, but it now moved through lanes that had enough room for Eli to carry a reel without getting hooked by greenbrier every 10 steps. He had not transformed all 64 acres. That was another change in his thinking. At first, he measured the farm against the total property line. Any brush outside the active area felt like unfinished work. By year 4, he measured usable options. Could he rest one paddock longer if another was ready? Could he feed near the barn without sacrificing a recovering slope? Could he move the herd around wet ground instead of through it? Could he use a machine safely, where a machine was efficient, and use goats, where terrain and vegetation made browsing more useful? Could he see a problem early enough to choose rather than react? Those questions mattered more than whether every acre looked clean from the road. One afternoon in late August, Eli found the old clearing estimate in the glove box while looking for a registration paper. The folds were soft from 4 years of heat. A coffee stain covered one corner. The total at the bottom still looked large. He carried it up the hill, not because he had beaten the contractor's price. That comparison would have been dishonest. Eli had spent real money too. Goats cost money. Fence cost money. Feed cost money. Minerals, veterinary care, seed, lime, posts, chargers, hose, repairs, and time all cost money. The animals had not turned expensive land improvement into free land improvement. What they changed was where the money and labor went. Instead of paying once to force the entire hillside into a finished shape, Eli had built a system that could keep responding as the land changed. Some years that system used more hay. Some years it used more fence. Some sections still needed a saw. Some plants came back no matter how satisfied Eli felt after a good grazing pass. But the farm no longer presented every problem as an all-or-nothing clearing job. It gave him choices. That evening, he moved the herd into a cell near the top of the original block. The white blazed doe from the first spring was older now. She did not lead every move anymore, but she was still in the group. A younger doe pushed past her as Eli opened the netting. The herd entered quietly. They spread along the brush edge and began selecting leaves. No charge, no miracle. Just animals doing what the system had been designed to let them do. Eli walked the outside of the cell while they settled. Near an old cedar stump, he found one of the orange survey ribbons he had tied during the first year. The plastic had faded almost white on the sunward side. The knot was tight around a rusted piece of old fence. He cut it loose. For a moment he remembered what those ribbons had meant when he first put them there. They were markers for confusion. A way to find the corners in brush he could not see through. A temporary answer on land that seemed too tangled to organize. Now the lane behind him was open enough to walk. The water line was where he expected it. The next rested cell was already planned. The lower ground still needed another week. Hay was stacked near the barn in case weather changed the plan. The farm was not finished. It was finally manageable. Eli tucked the faded ribbon into his pocket and clipped a new orange flag to the post beside tomorrow's gate. For the first time, the orange flag was not marking what a machine would clear. It was marking where the herd would stop.